Okay, welcome to episode 2 of the Hours to Days Challenge. If you're new to this, and obviously this is only the second episode, the premise is improving our resiliency from 72-hour preparedness, which is what a lot of governments push, 3 days of preparedness for off-grid or disasters, to 72 days and everything that comes along with that. So today's episode is called Taking Stock. I find that a lot of people's imagination gets a hold of their reality or ahead of their reality, and we lose sight of what we actually have, and our perception of our gaps and needs is driven by marketing as opposed to just by observation of what's around us. So in this episode, I'm going to give you some areas. This is a homework episode. This is for you to do. I'm going to do it, but I'm not necessarily sharing all my results with you. But something for you to do is taking stock, and I'm going to suggest that you kind of focus on these categories, which I'll list for you now, and then I'll discuss each one a little bit in turn. So I'm going to suggest that you focus on documents, on planning and procedures. I couldn't read my list from way over there. It powered off. Come back. Okay, take 2. Documents, plans and procedures, communication equipment, community, water, food, fuel, hygiene products, first aid and medicines, tools, finances, security, and recreation. So let's start with a couple of the boring ones first. Documents, plans, and procedures. A lot of the kinds of disasters that are going to strike, that are going to cause you to be off-grid or without power or services for a few days, can best easily be dealt with a few simple preparation plans. So one thing that you should have on hand is copies of your essential documents. Whether those are on some kind of an electronic form or physical photocopies that you can have stored in a place where they're quick to grab and access. Could be passwords, could be banking information, those kinds of things. Just keep them all safe and hidden. But you probably should have copies of those kinds of documents. It's also really important to have plans and procedures in place. So we all know that a lot of people don't know how to shut off the water to the house, the power to their house, deal with electrical outages in those kinds of ways. Maybe have a generator, don't know how to hook it up to their house to run it. So it's good to have those kinds of documents and procedures in place, even though they're super boring. So what you're imagining when the power goes down and you're sitting there reading through your booklet of house procedures, but those are very, very important to prevent your house from freezing, flooding, pipes cracking, electrical fires, all those kinds of problems. You should have all the stop-start procedures for any appliances you have. So if you've got like a furnace that's gas, electric, propane, oil, or whatever, those are the kind of documents that you want to have. Maybe short form them in notes so you know exactly what to do in the case of a power outage. Okay, communication equipment. Communication is key in any kind of a disaster scenario. Anxiety is probably the worst part of it, is not knowing what's going on or what's happening or what the timelines are for recovery. In my area, I'll get text messages as soon as there's a power outage. My utility company starts sending text messages and then sends updates with their estimated recovery times for different zones where the outage is. And that's really key for my planning. If I know that it's only going to be a 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour outage, there's nothing I need to do, right? But if it's an extended outage, it's going to be 24 hours or maybe longer than that. That's where I start to think about my perishable food, my backup heating systems, my water supply, and that kind of a thing. So you really need to have good communication equipment, and you're also going to want to be able to reach out and connect with people around you. So that could be like a verbal communication pathway, could be like hunting radios or shortwave radios or things like that. But you're going to want to have a look at what your communication setup is. You should also give a little bit of thought to the community around you, whether those are people near or far who are like-minded or not like-minded, people that you can rely on in an emergency, people that you need to watch out for in an emergency, people that you need to keep distance from in an emergency. So it's always a good idea to take stock of your community in the context of disaster planning. Okay, you know you need water. That's pretty straightforward for cooking, cleaning, and hygiene. So maybe have a little look at what's the water that you have on hand. You know, can you fill a bathtub? You know, it's kind of not the greatest way to grab water in emergency because bathtubs are pretty gross. But can you fill a bathtub? Can you get water out of the back of your toilets? Do you know how to flush your toilets from a bucket? Do you have surface water nearby? Do you have water filtration systems? Or do you maybe keep water in some quantity in these big 55-gallon drums? There are lots of different ways to have a water supply. And again, if we're looking at moving from a 72-hour to 72 days of resiliency, that's a huge quantity of water. And so I would suggest that it's not practical for most people to store that much water, but it might be practical to have the means to treat that much water in an emergency. Fuel for backup power for your vehicles, for cooking, for heating. I'm going to include in the fuel category things like battery banks to charge your electrical devices, because that's what we're more reliant on now. And then maybe the means to charge your power banks to charge your devices, so something like a solar panel, a electric bicycle kind of a thing that you pedal to produce power, whatever you've got. So maybe just make a short list of the kinds of fuel that you have for those purposes, especially for cooking though. Butane, propane, charcoal, fuel wood, whatever is appropriate to situation. Hygiene over 72 days. You know, I like to watch, and we'll talk about purchasing strategies in another video so that we can do this at zero cost or even save money. But I like to buy things when they're on sale, so I usually have a couple months of toothpaste stored up. I probably by accident have a couple of years of bar soap because I overbought one time when it was on a really good sale price, and I used way less bar soap than I thought. But you might want to look into, like, you know, what you have for hygiene, for cloths, for soaps, for cleaning products, sanitization, to take care of yourself over a period of time like that, and people who might rely on you. Medicines and first aid. I think a lot of people have a basic first aid kit, and you know, really in an emergency, you might want to have something a little more advanced to deal with more serious wounds that, you know, because of if there's less hygiene in an emergency, you're more likely to get infections. But the important one is to be able to stock your personal medications that you need by maybe figuring out how to extend the supply of them so you have a more than whatever the length of a prescription is, 30 days on hand. I think a lot of doctors, if you explained your situation to them and it was something other than controlled narcotics, they would write you a prescription so that you have a 2-month or a 3-month supply and you're always filling them ahead. Tools. You might want to consider what tools you have that would be suitable in an emergency. So, for example, I always considered that one of our biggest emergencies would be a grid down from a power outage type situation. And I have been in a scenario like that before. And really the handiest thing to have was my my chainsaw gear and a good sharp axe and a handsaw. And it just really involved a lot of wood cutting for a couple days to like clear out all these fallen trees and make things safe again. But your situation might be different. You might be concerned about tools for repairs and construction over a 72-day period. You might have things that you need to fix. You might like in your tool category to look at what materials you have on hand for doing repairs and construction. And you might want to think about tools that are required for food procurement, whether that's gardening, fishing, hunting, or trapping. Talk about finances really quickly. So finances in a emergency situation, you might not have access to banking, or maybe you can still do e-transfers, which would be a great way to operate in an emergency, but more likely you're going to require cash on hand. So you might want to think about what your habits are about having cash on hand, or a safe box at home where you keep a little bit of extra cash for emergencies like that. Security, and go through the security checkbox and maybe have a look at, electronic security devices that you have, electronic house locks, window locks, cameras, things that may or may not function in a power outage situation, and how you might power them up if you need to. You might think about things like masks and filters and personal protective equipment. I always think in my case, again, one of my main concerns in my area is forest fires. And so I think that some kind of a respirator mask would be really handy in the event that there was a forest fire and I was kind of trapped in my location and needed to be working around my property to try and minimize fire damage. You can also look at self-defense items. So you might have like fencing around your house. You might have self-defense tools. We're not going to jump into like firearms and things like that, but you might want to take stock of your personal defense items and ammunition. And lastly, recreation. You are probably in most situations that I've experienced recently with lockdowns pretty bored, and it's always good to give some consideration to having a few decks of playing cards on hand, maybe some books that you haven't read but you can have them nearby, puzzles, movies, games, especially if you have kids. They will happily watch screens all day, as will some adults, I suppose, as well. So that's just my checklist of categories, and the value of doing a taking stock activity is that it really helps to put in perspective for you what the things are that you're most concerned about and that are going to give you the greatest sense of security. So, whether that's having a reliable supply of water outside of grid water, or if it's knowing that you can power medical devices and have a supply of medication in the event that there's an extended power outage or service outage. Could be any number of scenarios. You're only limited by your imagination. But I like to look at those categories and kind of go through and remind myself that, I actually have most of the things that I need. And if they're not ideal for the job, I'm a kind of a creative problem solver, and I know that I have things that I can use instead of maybe the ideal solution. But once you've got a few basics on hand, it really helps you to be resilient in the face of any kind of adversity. So have a look through your stuff. You might want to do paper and pen list. You might just want to do a mental checklist. You might just want to sit back with a coffee or a cold drink and kind of think through those categories and picture what you've got and where your gaps may be, and just start to map that kind of stuff out. In some upcoming videos, we're going to dive into portions of each of those categories in a little more detail. So we will talk about water, for example, and what it might mean to store or acquire a 72-day supply of water. So we'll talk about some different techniques there. We'll talk about food storage. We'll talk about hygiene products. I didn't even say the word toilet paper yet, but that was a hot commodity in the COVID times. So that would be something to look at. And we'll kind of tackle each of those in turn over a series of videos. And again, I'm looking for your feedback, your suggestions, what topics are interesting to you. I know I've been keeping track from the first episode and also from the community post that I put out before the new year. So please keep sending me that feedback, and we will get into some of these topics in a little more detail in upcoming videos. As I mentioned, I feel a little repetitive right now, but that's where I'm going to stop. And so I will see you on the next one, YouTube.